Welcome to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast, where we celebrate the craft of poetry. Each week, we feature interviews with incredible poets and artists, including Olivia Gatwood and A.E. Stallings, and original poetry read by the authors. I'm your host, James Moorhead, Poet Laureate of Dublin, California, and author of Canvas and Portraits of Red and Gray. Sarah Kobrinsky was the 2013-2015 Poet Laureate of Emeryville, California. She is the author of Nighttime on the Other Side of Everything, New Rivers Press, 2019. Her poems and stories have appeared in Magma Poetry, Red Light Lit, 1111, Monkey Bicycle, 82 Review, 100 Word Story, Ford's Review, among many others. She was longlisted for the 2019 University of Canberra Vice-Chancellor's Poetry Prize. She was born in Canada, raised in North Dakota, seasoned in England, and tempered in California. I love that part of your bio. Sarah, welcome to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
What was your first memory of poetry catching your imagination?
My parents have always been very playful with language. And they were always, puns. And my mom's favorite pastime was rewriting or changing the lyrics of popular songs. So there was always a bit of that around. But my first memory of poetry, the first poem I ever wrote, I was in kindergarten. Mm-hmm. And it was for my dad. And it was something like, my dad loves bad weather. My dad loves when it rains. And I drew a picture of my father under a storm cloud.
Wonderful. So your bio mentions living in Canada, North Dakota, England, and now California. How have the differences in these places influenced your writing?
Oh, good question. I think because I've lived in, 3 different English-speaking countries, I'm fascinated by regional idioms. And sometimes I'll say things and people will look at me like, what are you talking about? And then I'll forget that it's something I picked up in England or something that's, strictly Canadian. Or so I just love regional language. I love idioms. I play a lot with idioms, so I'm sure you've seen in the book. And that's definitely a direct result of living in 3 different countries that speak the same language, but in very subtly different ways.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that the way you use language definitely picks up on those differences, and it's really neat that you call that out. So humor can be deceiving. Humor plays a role in many of your poems, and many times humor is a vehicle to communicate something much more serious. One example from Ladyoplasty. Next, she'll have her teeth, her hair, even her asshole bleached for good measure. You can never be too beautiful, too clean, or too white. From your readings and the Patagonia event that we both participated in, it was a terrific example of where you engage the audience with humor. What effect does humor play in communicating your message, and how deliberate and conscious is that?
Sometimes I can't help it. I'll try to, be serious and, some kind of joke or irreverence will emerge. But when I grew up, my father is a pediatric cancer doctor. And in that world, it's hard. And my father has the darkest gallows humor, as a survival technique. You just have to, sometimes you just have to laugh at things because it's a release. Sometimes it's the only way to swallow something really difficult and uncomfortable is laughing at it. But yeah, and also, being Canadian and living in the UK, they have a very dark sense of humor there.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Very sarcastic. And, I've just been exposed to that. And like I said, I think I just grew up in an environment where humor was a survival technique, just to really deal with difficult things.
And you also incorporate in your, and this is for listeners, I strongly encourage you to go seek out Sarah's performance at the Patagonia Poet Laureate Celebration, which is on Viewless Wings and on an earlier episode of the podcast, where you actually engage the audience in a very humorous way. Is that something that was just that one poem you've read, or is that a technique you've used in other poems where you actually get the audience to participate in the poem?
I think that started a little bit before the pandemic because, poetry readings, can be dry, or can be, it's hard to just sit and listen, especially to poetry. When you have an evening of, say, 4+ authors, it's really hard to give them the attention they deserve, every single writer. So I feel like I love breaking it up. I mean, when did it start? I think the first time it started, it wasn't a poem, but I wrote this essay about when I was training to become a perinatal yoga instructor, and we had to have a pelvic floor workshop. And I was horrified at the idea that one could have a prolapsed uterus. And I came home from the workshop and I said to my husband, "We're never having kids. Did you know that your uterus can fall out of your body?" And he said, "Yeah, of course I do," because he grew up on, around animals. "Yeah, I've seen it all the time. It happens to cows, but don't worry." He's like, "You just take a couple sticks, take the uterus, shove the horns back up into the fallopian tubes, put some sugar on the uterus to stop the swelling, and you'll be fine." Of course, that's what you do with the cow. And
right.
And when I was reading that exercise, I led the whole cafe in doing Kegel exercises. And after that, I thought, it's just fun. It's just fun to stand up, to just, feel like you're a part of what's going on. I mean, because the poem is a piece of art, but then the moment you're telling it, the moment of the telling is also an art. And so it's just fun to be childlike, to do silly things, yeah. So it's fairly new, but I enjoy it.
Yeah, no, it's inspired me to think of a way to do. I'm doing a pretty lengthy reading in a couple weeks, and I'm thinking of how I can actively engage the audience. I thought it was super effective. It really got people leaning in and attentive and engaged. It's great. So I read an interview where you discussed growing up in an Orthodox Jewish household. How has Judaism influenced the themes in your writing?
Wow. Okay, that's a big question. Yeah, I was in a very religious community, probably until I was about 12. Didn't wear pants, kept strict kosher. Oh, if I were to say I don't wear pants in England, they would think I wasn't wearing like trousers, because pants in England means underwear, as an example of language changing.
Yes.
So when I say we didn't wear pants, what I mean is we didn't wear trousers. We wore skirts. We were women, young girls expected to do that. How has it influenced me? It's just, it was my primary socialization, the Torah, all those stories, all the marking of the seasons with the various holidays. It's just so ingrained in me. It's a part of me, like it or not.
Yeah.
It's just in the hopper.
It's just in the mix. It's almost impossible to unthread it and figure out what the influence is. I can understand that. Yeah. So we talked about this, that I thoroughly enjoyed your performance at the Patagonia Poet Laureate Celebration and how you engaged listeners. How did you learn how to perform your poetry more generally? And in my own experience, a couple of years ago, I hired a poetry coach to help me, because who's also a theater graduate and competes in poetry competitions. And my self-assessment was I was dreadful at reading my poetry, and I'm sure we're all very self-critical, more than is fair, but I think it was fairly fair to say I was pretty flat and I think I've gotten a lot better, and I've still got work to do. But what has been your approach to making the performances of your poetry build them up rather than bring them down?
I'm actually an incredibly shy person. I hide it well. Mm-hmm. But I think, I don't know if you've ever seen this in a detective show, where the person or the criminal who's speaking very slowly is sometimes more scary than the person who is raging, who is kind of more controlled and very quiet, kind of makes you listen to the person who's talking. So I somehow slow it down. Mm-hmm. I guess I don't think about it too much, but I will slow down what I'm reading sometimes. And gosh, I don't know. I've just been sort of throwing myself into performance spaces since I was really young. When I was in England, in back rooms of pubs, that were really loud, or just always putting my hair in that way. So my friend Betty, who is a poet, she always said that what she took from me reading was just slowing it down. Just slowing it down and looking. I like to look at, if I can see people in the room and sort of feel how they're feeling. And so it's sometimes if I'm doing a reading and I don't generally always choose my poems before. I'll have a sort of a general selection, but we'll try to intuit the energy of the room.
Mm-hmm.
Do they need something funnier? Do they need something more serious? Whatever.
No, it's definitely advice I've gotten is I speak East Coast fast, and I have to consciously slow myself down. What feels really slow to me is average speed for listeners, and I have to keep reminding myself of that. So many of the poems in Nighttime and the Other Side of Everything are compact and impactful. In X and Y Have Another Fight, the title provides critical context, and in Domestic Violence you write, her face reminded him of the red velvet cake she made that night. It was all he could do to keep from... and there's an M dash. When writing short poems, do you tend to start with something longer and then edit to a short poem, or do you start with the intention of writing something short? It felt that way from the beginning? Because writing impactful short poems is really hard.
I'd say I do both. Sometimes it'll arrive very short and whatever, and sometimes it'll be very long. And I'm a big fan of pare down, pare down, pare down. Less is more, less is more, less is more. And it actually, I think, when I was first starting to write, you just want to hang on to every word that you birthed,
Mm-hmm.
And now I have a detachment where it's just easy, like, nope, that's not working. And, I can put it somewhere else or throw it away entirely, and having a bit of distance so it doesn't kill me every time.
Yeah, no, I definitely found that when I edit something, and at the moment I'm editing, I'm like, oh, God, I thought that was so clever. But then minutes later, I will completely forget whatever that thing I cut was. And that's a pretty good sign that, yep, that was a good edit, because I can't even remember what the heck it was. I have to look at my Google Docs revision history to even find out what I had previously. So you write about very personal and tragic subjects in some cases. In The Great Pace, you write, and you were mambling under your breath. Mambling, that was your word. Prayers that made sense only for you. Your observations of a family member battling addiction is very moving. How do you approach the revision and editing of such a personal memory, and how is your sharing this memory impacting readers facing similar challenges?
That's a tough question. Well, and that's an example of where my Orthodox life came out, just the stories that shaped my world. Because in that poem, I imagine, Orthodox Jews, the men wear phylacteries, the leather that they put around their heads and around their arms. And then I always thought when they're wrapping their arms in leather that they were prayer junkies.
Mm.
And so that image just reminded me of my brother who was a recovering heroin addict. I guess, that's an example of how my Orthodox background feeds my work now. But I haven't had anybody directly tell me about their own experiences with addiction or their relatives' experience with addiction from that poem. But sometimes we're afraid to write about family or people close to us, that they might see it or misinterpret it, or and I try not to think about that as I'm getting things down. Just sort of, write it deal with the consequences later.
Right, right. Yeah, no, it is.
Yeah.
It is very challenging because I think every poet incorporates a lot of their personal experiences are woven in, and the poetry wouldn't exist without them. And yeah, it's very tricky sometimes knowing where to draw the line and where not to, but ultimately be true to the poetry. So it was very interesting hearing some of the backstory and other elements of that poem that I didn't understand or appreciate from a first reading. So you successfully placed many of the poems in your book and then convinced a publisher to turn your manuscript into a book. Both are very impressive accomplishments that all poets are seeking. What have you learned about publishing your poetry in this journey?
What have I learned? For a while, I worked at an architecture firm, and I was in the interior design department. I wasn't a designer and I'm not an architect. I was there sort of in a administrative / marketing capacity. And this is a very large firm. And there were, at that time, about 80 people in the interiors department. So these are some, big experts on color and shape, etc. And everybody would turn up in black every day. And I said to my colleague, the woman who shared the cubicle with me, and I said, hey, Emily, what's the deal? You guys are the world's expert on color. Why are you wearing black? And she said, well, like it or not, we subconsciously are drawn to color palettes or to colors that we are wearing. And so by having something, I don't want to say neutral because black isn't neutral, but having something that doesn't have an obvious color palette stops you from doing that. And so I feel like that was a big lesson in when you're submitting works to journals or to whomever, that I imagine not all the editors are wearing their black, and they're wearing the colors of their emotional palette. And so and I think that really drives their choices or what they're drawn to. And in other words, I try not to take it personally when I'm rejected. This person is drawn to whatever poem in that moment because of the emotional color they're wearing, if that makes sense.
Oh my God, what a terrific answer and a way to look at it. That is going to be, because I've heard many answers about, it's a numbers game and there's just so many submitted. And as a result, even the best, there's going to be lots of good things that aren't selected. And that's all true, but that's a wonderful image, very poetic image that's going to stick with me for a while. So during your tenure as Emeryville's Poet Laureate, what did you learn about being a Poet Laureate that you can, pass along? Myself, I'm in the middle of my term as City of Dublin's Poet Laureate, and I'm as interested in this personally as for other folks that are either considering applying to be a Poet Laureate or have the role and are figuring out what to do with it. What did you learn during your tenure?
I think it's wonderful that a lot of city councils are choosing to have a Poet Laureate, recognizing that, the arts are important and that, poetry is important. Emeryville is a very unique place. They really, really value and cherish their artists, not just writers, but their visual artists. They have a big annual visual art show every year. And so even though I'm not Poet Laureate anymore, I still do an ekphrastic poetry workshop every year where we go into their Emeryville's annual art show and write poems inspired by the art that year. So what have I learned? One of the challenging things I had was, I'd read at sort of official events, and the toughest reading I ever did was The Lighting of the Tree. And the only thing between the children and meeting Santa Claus was me and my holiday poem. Toughest crowd ever. So, yeah. And then I also realized that, I was always afraid of, I just didn't know what a municipal poem could be or should be. And then I realized that you just have to stay true to what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you're writing poems for official events, just stay true to who you are and the way you write, you know. But what did I learn? I also learned, I mean, not just from the laureateship, but just standing up in front of a room of people anyway. Just the fact that you're standing up in front of a room full of people, they will automatically hand over a bit of authority to you. They're automatically ready to trust you and believe in you. And that's comforting.
That's a terrific reminder. And I've certainly felt that in a couple of the official events. And I took great care to make good use of the time. But yes, they're rooting for you to do well. They're not antagonistic. So now I'm going to pass the mic over to you to share several selections from your book.
So this is a poem called A Poem for John Who Writes in Elevens. And it's for John Oliver Simon, who was a beloved Berkeley poet. And he died maybe a year before the pandemic. He was 75 years old. And he devoted his entire adult life to poetry. He was very much involved in the California Poets in the Schools. And he just championed younger writers. And whenever he would be invited to a reading, even into, till his very last readings, he always recited everything from heart. He never brought any paper with him or any books, and he would just recite, lines and lines and lines of verse. And it would just make, put the rest of us to shame. I'm sure that a lot of us poets, we labor over our poems and, we know every word and line, but there's something about having the safety of a piece of paper or a book when you're up in front of other people. But he wouldn't. He would get up there and recite without anything. And for the last while of his life, he wrote these poems that had 11 syllable lines. So, and they were sonnets, so they were 14 lines long, each line 11 syllables. But this poem I wrote for him, it's 11 lines, and each line is 11 syllables. And it's my tribute to John, who was just such a beloved local, unofficial poet laureate of Berkeley, So a poem for John who writes in 11s. There are 11 syllables in this line. 11, 11, my dear. Make a wish. This is also a Dear John letter, dear John, but not that kind of a Dear John letter, John. I just wanted to feel your form, try you on, count and count again the stars in Joseph's dream. Did you see any stars when you were under? Are you any lighter now that growth is gone? Once I heard of a man who kept his tumor on his mantle in a jar next to his wife. He wished on it, like on a star, called it John. So my next poem is called Nuts to That. And myself and 3 other poets were invited to view the Speakeasy San Francisco interactive theater experience show about, maybe 5 years ago. And it was an incredible space, an incredible theater experience. So this was, each of us poets were tasked with following one character around the entire evening. And so this is based on the character that I followed through this immersive theater experience. And it's called Nuts to That. Through the grandfather clock, through the looking glass, behind closed doors, under wraps. Be careful. The walls have ears. No, really. The walls have ears. See over there, that mirror? Pick up the receiver. What do you hear? The still small voice of your heart sure speaks easy, no? The voice that says, I could have been somebody, like that giant Giannini. Well, in this gin joint, you are somebody. We won't stifle the likes of Gustav Eiffel or any ordinary guy chasing after the American dream, holding out his empty hands for the next sawbuck, the next big win, the next big ship to come in. Through the grandfather clock, through the highball glass, Inside coat pockets at the craps. A bottle of hooch with just enough burn, but won't make you blind. On the contrary, it'll make you see you're still in the game, still going strong, your hopes and dreams distilled into one moment, one card, one chip, double down, and then it's gone. My last poem is the most accurate portrait I have ever written about my family. I will say that since I wrote this poem, I have quit smoking. I just need to say that. Many, many years ago, I quit smoking. But this poem is called Jesus Smokes. My father, the cancer doctor, sits at the head of the table, coughing like his father, a cancer doctor, coughed in the oxygen tent in the room in the hospital in Canada. My grandfather, a Russian immigrant famous for his Anglophilia, leaned out of his oxygen tent with his riding crop and whispered through cancerous spittle, "My son, you must become a doctor." My father, who didn't want to become a doctor, sits at the head of the table coughing up white smoke. It's Passover, and everyone's on their third glass of wine. In his best Rabbi Burkle voice, my father chants a blessing, then says, "Jesus smokes." Now, the Jesus reference is weird because we're Jewish, but my father, the cancer doctor, he's famous for saying things that are weird, like, Jesus smokes. Myself and my 5 siblings, all confirmed smokers, and our mother, an ex-smoker, sit around our father, the non-smoker, smoking. Our father, the cancer doctor, who likes to be referred to as the blood count, clears his throat and looks upon our ashen faces. Just as Jesus died for the people's sins, I cough for my children's smoke. Jesus smokes. Our father, the Jewish doctor, sits at the head of the table and chants another blessing. My children, you must never become doctors. So my sister, the chain smoker, and my mother, the ex-smoker, and my brother, the social smoker, and my eldest brother, the I'm so broke I roll my own smoker, and my youngest brother, the chronic pot smoker, and my other brother, the I just quit so can I have one of yours smoker, and me, the I feel so guilty because I smoke smoker, all agree to never become doctors. Our father, the would-be witch doctor, sits at the head of the table and instructs us in his bathrobe to pour the 4th glass of wine. Blessed are you, ruler of the universe, who doctored the fruit of the vine. And for a moment, none of us are smoking. Elijah's wind moves through the room and everything is silent. Our father, the cancer doctor, sits at the head of the table, laughing like his father, the cancer doctor, laughed when he heard the news he was going to have a son who might, God willing, be a doctor someday. Jesus smokes.
Oh, I love that poem when I first heard it at the Patagonia Poet Laureate celebration. I loved hearing it again, the way you perform it. And humor is such a difficult thread to weave into poetry. I have a lot of respect for stand-up comedians and the way they hone and hone and hone, and it takes, a year plus to come up with a good 45 minutes. It's just really much harder than people realize. So a couple of questions about that. Are there some poets that incorporate humor that you're particularly inspired by, or as Billy Collins has said, read poetry that you're jealous of, that you want to reach for, and then are there in the editing and revision process, how do you approach getting the humor just right? Is it pure instinct, or do you have an approach a way of sort of determining if you're getting it right?
Inspiration, Stevie Smith. I love her poems. I just absolutely love them. And, sometimes quote unquote funny poetry gets confused with light verse.
Mm-hmm.
And, I find that problematic because sometimes just because a poem has an element of humor or is funny doesn't mean that it's kind of a throwaway, haha, whatever. But yeah, I love Stevie Smith, huge inspiration. And the editing process, to this day, I write every single thing by hand. So I'd say the bulk of the paring down happens when I finally get down to typing it up on a computer. It's part instinct, it's very visual for me, like how I always am considering the visual element of a poem in addition to the arranging it that so when it's said, it has the music that I want. But I'm very anal about how it looks visually. There has to be some kind of compositional balance just looking at it on a page. And I think that definitely influences my editing process. But yeah, I'd say instinct,
And then building on the visual side, which of course, given we're a podcast, I can't hold up and show you the poetry, but I do encourage people to go buy Sarah's book. In terms of when you have a piece of the poem that's either very important and impactful and you want it to be amplified, or it's a piece of humor that you want to get the timing right, how does that influence how you make use of the tool we have in poetry that prose doesn't have, of how you visualize it on the page?
Sometimes I would say that I have the last lines first. And sometimes I know where I want to go, and that really drives the shape, the structure of the poem. That I don't want to be like, oh, it's a surprise every time it just happens. I mean, because I do have, obviously, at this point, some control over what I'm doing. I guess sometimes I'm not always aware that it's funny right away.
Interesting.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Or I'm like, oh, wow, this is really dark, and this is really, really funny. And, I've heard a lot of people say this, that they don't know what they're writing about or what they think about something until it's finished. And that's I don't know. I've heard other writers say that.
Oh, it's definitely the case with me. I will, I used to write exclusively longhand on paper, and then I started getting hyper productive like at midnight, or I'd wake up in the middle of the night, and especially during the pandemic, and stressed out, couldn't get back to sleep. So the only practical thing to do is to write on my phone in Google Docs on dark mode. So I wouldn't wake up my wife. And what was interesting about that is it's very hard to deal with visualization on a phone. So I would just focus on words and images, and it was actually quite helpful. And then I would then revisit the poem when I got it in a full computer. Then I would actually start working on what the heck this thing is, but I wouldn't get hung up with that initially. So I think I've heard that from many poets, is you don't really know what the heck you're writing until afterwards, and you start crafting it into something. And even then, sometimes you don't know what it is, and other people tell you what it is. All right.
Because it just sounds cool. And then, I'm so driven by sound and the music of things first. I'll hear something or I'll write something that I like how that sounds. And I may have no idea what the meaning is but I just like that as a piece of auditory candy,
Yeah, well, definitely since an interview I did with Olivia Gatwood last year, and she really emphasized reading things out loud, and as did A.E. Stallings. I didn't do that earlier because I never performed my poetry till really a couple of years ago. And now I aggressively read my poetry out loud and test it against family members, whether they want me to or not. And it makes such a difference to read it out loud and hear it. So just a couple more things. So Nuts to That has such a 1920s sound, perfectly complements the speakeasy theme, and I loved hearing the backstory. And so what role does research play in your poetry? And I think I asked this question several times of different interviews, because I think it plays much more of a role than people realize.
Research is a fun way to be writing but not writing. That's a fun way to, I don't know. I think it's so great that if you're out in the world and you see something that tickles your fancy, and then you can go to the internet or go and just learn more about it. And it's such a good way to fill out whatever it is. In that poem, Nuts to That, a lot of that was, inspired completely from the experience. I mean, they had done their research. The whole place was just incredible. You were in a speakeasy. It was incredible. But it's a fun thing to do when you want to write, but you can't write or aren't, I don't know, just to feed the well. But I've also heard that research can be dangerous. You can do it too much and avoid the actual writing of the thing.
Yeah, I think that there's a risk of getting lost in the research or too dependent on it, and there's definitely a balance. So finally, what are you working on now?
So in the pandemic, I feel like there are two writers in the pandemic: writers who wrote more than they've ever written before, and then the writers who had little children. And the kids who were on Zoom school. So I wrote a lot. I wrote a lot of, I did manage both, even though I have a small child. I wrote a lot of prose, surprisingly. Mm-hmm. And I am working on a longer prose piece, novel length, and is it strictly memoir? Is it a novel? I will see when it's finished. But that's what I'm working on. And I also I'm slowly building another collection of poems, but prose poems.
Well, thank you so much for spending a few minutes to share your poetry and your story with the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast. Thoroughly enjoyed your book and enjoyed talking to you today.
Thanks for having me.
The Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast is written and produced by James Moorhead. You can follow me on Twitter at Dublin Ranch, subscribe to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast, and follow us on viewlesswings.com or on Instagram at viewlesswings.